Got a hearty hankering for Gwent.
Welcome to Good Gwent, everyone. I'm your host, Sin, and today I'm going to be talking about basic card game concepts as they pertain to Gwent. This is going to be a bit of a short video. It's going to lead into my next one, which is about deck building. I'm explaining some important concepts you have to keep in mind as you build your deck and as you play. And so the first thing we're going to start with is resources. Resources are anything that you can give up to achieve a result. Let's see, resources that you can give up are things like card advantage, board strength, graveyard. You can give up the pass. You can give up a mulligan. I actually suppose you can give up tempo too. That kind of falls in with board strength, but it's just a little bit different, just enough that I'd say that it's fair to say that you can also give up tempo separately of board strength. Mainly I'm thinking you might have only one card, like a silver or gold, that if you use it in a certain situation, it'll be a really strong tempo play, whereas in another situation, it'll be a much weaker tempo play but have a different effect. Mages come to mind. You can use a mage to use their whatever their damage effect is for big damage, usually a fairly large tempo swing, or use a weather card for a little more long-term value. Tempo and value are often connected, but sometimes they're at odds depending on the choices you got. So, yes, and some of this I know doesn't make sense yet, but we're going to go through these terms. So, what else do we have? Okay, so I covered resources. Value is, in other card games, is it can be a little bit more abstract than just hard numbers. It can do something that doesn't seem to contribute right away to you winning the game, but ultimately could win you the game and could be high value. In Gwent, it's almost a high value is almost always the result of how much swing and strength it is, board strength. So that's what value is the total strength swing of a card. So, for instance, Weather has a value, generally 2 points a turn. Alger's Thunder is a simple 7. Epidemic could be anything really, because it destroys all lowest units. Its value could be all over the board. Adrenaline Rush's value is dependent on what you used on. If you use it on a card that normally has a straight value of 8, and it carries over next turn, it gave you a value of 16 unless that value went unrealized. So if you use it on a card in round 1 and then you pass in round 2, or you on a 8 strength unit in round 2, and as soon as it starts, you dry pass because you won round 1, then your opponent just plays something that's 9, and they were going to play that card that was worth 9 strength anyways, it really didn't increase its value. That one's hard to call because you don't really know what their options were at that point. Quensign has a value between 2 and 6, plus whatever the shield absorbs. Again, hard to call. Mardraim has a value of whatever you're healing or resetting the unit, plus or minus 3. Or plus 3. Value is always positive. I guess we could talk in terms of negative value. Wouldn't we just call that deficit? No. I'm actually kind of wondering about this. I never thought about it till just now. Diametrium Shackle's value is 2 plus whatever it prevents your enemy from doing. If it's an engine card, that could be quite a lot. Lacerate is 3 plus for each unit on the row. Blood-curdling Roar is 11 minus the strength of the unit you destroyed with it. Arrakis Venom is 12 value. Marigold's Hailstorm is half of the value of the row, not including the golds, etc. Decoy is another one of those more complicated ones. Its value could be much higher than 3. Generally, it's going to be 3, but if you use it on a deploy ability, its value increases significantly. Or if you need to trigger another effect. Skellig Storm's value is 4 a turn. White Frost, also 4 a turn. Commander's Horn, 20. Alger's Thunder is 2 plus, whatever it's summoning. Scorch is a lot like Epidemic. Becker's Twisted Mirror could be between 0, actually it could be negative, or 20. As you can see, value really depends a lot on the cards and how they interact. But there's not going to be any kind of value plays that don't immediately give you value, usually. The closest one is going to be Quen. You can Quen something, and you may not see use of that Quen for a while because you won't play it a while. It doesn't immediately move up. It's a 0 tempo play. Next, we're going to talk about card advantage. Card advantage is simply the number of cards you have in your hand over your opponent. So if you're up 1, you're up 1 card advantage. In some card games, card advantage also talks about resources on the board, if that's important. So if you have like 15 things on the board, plus 5 in hand, you might have 20 card advantage. In Gwent, if they got 15 things on the board, that only really matters if they're going to play like Yennefer, or if they've got like a mass buff like Yennefer. All that really matters is their strength. If they have 15 cards but you're still ahead, if they have 15 cards on the board but you're still ahead, that doesn't matter a huge deal. So it's very situational, but that's generally not considered card advantage. And it's usually considered board advantage, and card advantage is like combines what's on the board with cards in hand. But usually when it's used, it usually just refers to the number of cards you have in hand over your opponent. So in Gwent, we're generally going to stick with it being the number of cards you have over your opponent, which is a huge part of the game, is maintaining CA. Tempo. Tempo is... I can explain it simply in terms of Gwent, but relative to other card games, I'm going to, real quick, look up the definition for other card games so I can give you a direct comparison. Tempo is a term used to describe the pace at which one plays threats. The concept of tempo to dissect the more intricate means of how and when lands and spells are played, as opposed to the race, which approaches aggressive strategies haphazardly. The player with a strong understanding of tempo can often put the game state in their favor without having to resort to copious amounts of card advantage or card utility for contingency's sake during the game. The term has its roots in musical notation, where it means the rate of movement between sounds in relation to one another. It was later adopted into chess where it found its origin in Magic the Gathering as gaining or losing position and productivity in relation to victory. So basically, to redistill that, it's how much you move towards achieving victory with any given play. And so in Gwent, usually tempo is referring to the amount of strength they will put on the board in a single play. Because remember, you get one play, and one play only, each of your turns. So if you're ahead on tempo, it means that you're consistently outpacing what the opponent's putting on the board in terms of strength. Tempo is hugely important in round 1. Situationally important in round 2, depending on your strategy, and whether you won or lost round 1 and need a win in round 2. And less important in round 3, although it can be just as important in round 3 as round 1, if it's going to be a long round 3. If you played a card, your opponent passed, then you played a card, or then you passed and your opponent played a card, so it's the longest round 3 you could possibly have. Tempo is suddenly a huge deal, so let's call it conditional in round 3. Contingent on whether the round is long or short. Tempo in round 3 can also be it can actually be the most important time for tempo to be important if round 3 is a short round and you only, say, have one card each. If you've got more tempo than your opponent in that one card, it's going to be very difficult for them to win the game. In fact, it's probably impossible. Unless they have something in their hand whose tempo scales, depending on yours. But if it's something like, say, Jade Figurine, they're not going to win by casting Jade Figurine on whatever you did. I'm thinking more something like Regis, the one that steals base strength. If you have one card and they have one card, although if you play multiple guys, Regis probably won't help. But if it's like, if your last card is a DBP and they play Regis, they're probably going to beat you in one card, and that was a bigger tempo play. In my opinion, in Gwent, listening to players talk about the game on Reddit, I have this feeling that most people generally get the idea of card advantage, that is good, that you want it, that you want to try to be up cards at any given point in the game. And while they may be aware of tempo, I think most players aren't really good at thinking about and utilizing tempo to achieve victory. I know it's something I'm still working on, to be perfectly honest. I'm aware of tempo plays, like what they are, it can be, but the list is exhaustive, and I'm not always able to be like, well, I'm sitting at 13 points over my opponent. Could they beat this with one play? I mean, sometimes I know they can. Specific plays. They play Tibor. Okay, I know what's going to happen. I know what he's worth. You know? DBP. Oh, they played a DBP last game. They played a DBP last turn. I know what the next one could fall into the range of. But there's just so many that I, for instance, don't know every tempo play that could be made at any given point yet. And I think even if you do have that kind of experience, I think still a lot of players that might have that sort of experience are still not really sure what to do with it. And the answer there is pass smart in round 1. That's what I think. If you know the deck's all the deck's plays and what tempo plays it could deliver, like if you like not just the faction itself, but all the tempo plays of a given deck. Like if you know they're playing a Harpooner Skellig, and you know that there's no way in hell they're going to play this other higher tempo play, then yeah, you can safely pass and maybe squeeze 2 cards out of them, or they'll just dry pass and give you the round. Or not dry pass, but they'll just pass and give you the round because they know they also can't beat that without spending 2 cards. So it's a really big deal to understand tempo, and understand the plays. And you see, a long time ago, I read this theory information from a Gwent, let's call him celebrity, who is pro, and I think he's pro anyways, and he does a lot of like information like I'm doing here, puts that stuff out. His name's Swim. I read it something where he was talking about how he thinks tempo was more important than card advantage, and back then when I read it, I didn't really quite get it. It took me a couple hundred games and moving up 10 ranks to really get why he said tempo is more important than card advantage. And yeah, I think in round 1 and in some very specific situations like we're talking about in round 3, tempo is huge. And also some deck matchups, actually, tempo becomes massive in round 2 between them. That's more of a thing in pro play, though. You generally won't see that in ladder games being won or lost because someone didn't pay attention to tempo, or if you do, it's because neither player paid attention to tempo and it was just coincidence. In pro ladder, things like the half-point card advantage of going second, spies, tempo, those things that generally won't affect lower level play games, those are actually pretty huge. So the next thing is the pass. I talked about the pass as a resource before, and that's because, yeah, you can give it up for something. If you go second, you can often give it up to gain card advantage. If you have a big enough lead on your opponent, you can also give it up to gain card advantage. That's generally what pass is given up for, is to gain card advantage. You can also pass in order to make your opponent go first in the next round, which of course only works if you don't need to win that round. So if you can pass in round 1 to make your opponent go first in round 2, if that's your plan. You can pass in round 2 if you don't need to win in round 2 to make your opponent go first in round 3. The pass is definitely a resource that you can give up. There's not a lot you can do with it, but it is a resource nonetheless. And lastly, mulligans are a resource. How do I put this? I'm actually not talking about the mulligans at the beginning of the game. Clearly, if you don't use them, it can hurt you. But you see, the thing about those is the mulligans at the beginning of each round, you can't hold on to those. You either use them or you don't. So you're not really giving them up to gain something at the beginning of the game. There's nothing to give up. You have to give them up if you don't use them. So they're gone either way. That's why I don't really count those as a resource. You see what I mean? If you don't need them, you're not losing anything. If you do need them, you're going to use them. You're not giving them up. I'm talking explicitly about mulligans that you induce with cards like Saskia or Vryhead Officer or Vess. Those mulligans are the kind of mulligans you're actually giving up to gain a resource advantage. Because you can hold on to those, you can choose when to use them, you can choose to get rid of them. And in some cases, like Saskia, you can choose not to use them at all when you play Saskia. So those are a resource you're giving up to gain an advantage. If you like what your hand looks like and you play Saskia and you choose not to mulligan anything, you're giving up her mulligans, which you could use theoretically any other point in the game, to gain advantage of keeping what's good in your hand at that moment. I'm just looking over my notes, and I think I've covered every game concept that's generally familiar. I guess I do have to say that there isn't any like resource such as mana or anything like that you have to use to play cards. The resource that you pay to get a unit or an effect is a card, and so the cards in your hand actually take the place of normally what you'd think of as mana for most card games. So I hope you guys found this very useful. The information hopefully was relevant, and I'll see you with the next one. I think it's going to be deck building.